Welcome to Partnered Up Business Law, Deals, and Dynamics.
Welcome to Partnered Up Business Law, Deals, and Dynamics with Jeffrey and Fink, partner at Corin Lichtenstein LLP in Massachusetts. Jeff advises business owners and partners on formation, growth, and dispute resolution for closely held companies. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about who actually has control in a business and why the operating agreement doesn't always tell the full story. Jeff, sir, welcome back.
Thank you, sir. Hope you're having a good morning.
Good to see you. Good to see you, Jeff. What do people think about when they think about who's in charge of a business?
Well, a lot of people have control issues, and closely held businesses tend to bring it out. There's so many different ways that people can argue over things. Who runs any particular part of a business on a day-to-day basis? Who runs the overall business? Who calls the operational shots for the business as a whole? Who decides on strategy? Is it one person? Is it a group? Are you part of that group? Who decides on big things like borrowing money or even selling the business? What kinds of things do people have to get consent for, like from a board of directors? Who do you have to go to for that? Sometimes it's just channeling our inner 2-year-olds. Who has the power to say no? And depending on who you're talking about and what the situation is, titles do matter to people. So those are the kinds of things that people think about when they think about control.
So Jeff, how often do you see situations where the operating agreement or corporate documents technically say one thing, but control looks very different in real life?
Well, I think the place we start is something we've been seeing more and more over the last few years, which is AI slop. There have been plenty of bad forms floating around on the internet for years, and now people have decided that, I don't want to mention the name of any particular AI program, but they've decided that they could just ask it to generate an operating agreement for them or a shareholders agreement for them, and that's often a problem. There are gaps. There are things that are just wrong for the business. Sometimes you have situations where even there are the terms that they use vary from paragraph to paragraph because the AI has pulled things out of a whole bunch of different places and not really integrated them well. For corporations, there has to have been at least some discussion of what control should be. Doesn't mean that people follow it all the time, but by law, you have to have a board of directors, you have to have a president, you have to have a treasurer, you have to have a secretary. Not that that means anything most of the time. So somebody's got to decide who's the primary person on the numbers and who's the outer face of the business. But things slip because, especially in smaller businesses, people do what they think they need to do and they incorporate and then they forget about it. And with the pressures of the business, things change. LLCs and partnerships, it can be a problem more often because they're not as structured, at least with operating businesses. If you've got two people who form an LLC to do something where they're actually going to run the business, they need to think about what operational control looks like, because otherwise whatever's in the document they're not going to pay attention to. They're more flexible, but they do need some more affirmative steps and more thinking about it to define what control is.
So Jeff, what's the difference among ownership percentage, right to profits and decision-making authority? How does that work out?
There are, and I wish somebody had told me this in school, and it would have made a whole lot more sense my first couple of years of practice. They're three totally different things. They may overlap depending on what your structure is, but they really are different things. So when you're thinking about ownership, I think the best way to think about that is what your rights are when the company gets sold. Don't think of it as what happens while you're still running the business. And that can get chopped up in lots of different ways. Money is salaries, guaranteed payments, dividends, distributions, They can be divided up in lots and lots of different ways, and it's going to be different for every business. There's no one magic way to do it. I mean, anybody who's listened to this podcast before will know that I say that all the time. There's no magic bullet. Um, Control and ownership and profit sharing do kind of feed into control. Sometimes when we see things that look like control issues, it's really about other stuff. So with an LLC, control is uh, it's more flexible, but the fundamental thing that you have to think about from a technical point of view is it member managed or is it manager managed? So member managed means you got three people who own an LLC and each of them can do everything unless there's some list of major things that require everybody to approve them. So that means anybody can go out and bind the company, and anybody can kind of do anything within the company unless you specify otherwise. Manager managed LLCs are, I would say, more common. Typically, there's a managing member. In a partnership, you'd have a managing partner, and that person can do a lot more of the day-to-day activities, the major decision making. And here's an example in like a lot of real estate development. You got the contractor who gets some investors to come in to buy a house to knock it down and put up a new one. That contractor is the one who's really running the business. So he or she is the manager, and really calls the shots except for some major things. And the investors used to be limited partners when limited partnerships were more common. The investors don't; they're kind of passive.
Mm.
And again, you can address all these issues, ownership, money, control in the legal documentation, but it looks different depending on what the legal form of the entity is.
So Jeff, what about, voting rights, management structure, and day-to-day authority? How do they interact once the business is actually operating?
Well, in the first instance, everything just kind of evolves. When you're looking at a small business, a startup, everybody kind of pitches in and does everything that's needed when there aren't many people around and you're just getting off the ground. And sometimes people naturally gravitate into different roles. Sometimes they join thinking, okay, here's what my role is going to be, and you're a step forward that way. Um, there are patterns that it may follow, and documentation can either set up a structure to manage it, an aspirational structure, or a structure that's a dividing line between certain people and roles. Again, it's depending on what's needed. So, for example, in a corporation, it's kind of textbook law. The employees do the work. Officers are there for kind of day-to-day management decisions. The board is there for oversight purposes and for bigger decisions, and the shareholders elect the board and then get to make some bigger decisions, some of the biggest decisions. In LLCs, it's squishier just because it's more flexible, which is great in the right circumstances, but you can't necessarily rely on whatever the statute's going to say is the default. So again, a lot of operating businesses start out pretty loose. They get more formal as time goes on. And again, like with something like these real estate investment partnerships, they can be more formal to start. And the thing that people should keep in mind is they can always change stuff down the road. If it's a corporation, you can change officers, you can change job descriptions. In an LLC, you can, again, change job descriptions. Some LLCs actually have officers. They're set up that way. So you can kind of mimic that corporate structure if that's right for you. But you can always change it down the road.
Where do things tend to break down when partners haven't, thought through how control was allocated at the very beginning of this process?
That is the $10,000 question, or maybe the $100,000 question, maybe the $1 million question. Pressures change people. They change how they interact with people they work with. They change the things that they're thinking about when they're making decisions. It's, this is just on a personal level. It could be work stuff. The business environment may start to affect people just generally, in times that the economy is not doing so great. That does put pressure on people. And people talk a lot about bringing work home. Well, a lot of people, all of us actually, bring home into the office. So if you've had a fight with your partner at home, you may not be so kindly disposed to your partner in the office. Or it may come as a relief to be in the office. It just
Yeah.
really all depends on the situation. Another thing is a kind of a shifting sense of what's important. People may have different viewpoints of things as time
Mm.
evolves. And if they haven't thought through how control works, that can start to cause some friction. The Again, the kind of micro business environment may change. What's a good example? You're in a retail environment and you can't source something,
Mm.
so you have to change, and people fight over it. You're in a manufacturing environment and you're having trouble getting components from China because suddenly they've gotten much more expensive. You have to pivot. Can you do that and not argue over it? A little bit of argument's okay, but when it gets toxic, it's not good. Then people argue over other things too. Everybody wants their little fiefdom at work where they're in control of it, and people argue over the boundaries of that and how much you have to talk to others. Again, strategy is a huge one. Money and status, uh, all of that can show up as fighting over control.
And speaking of that, though, when these disagreements arise around control, what kind of things escalate that conflict? What tends to calm things down?
So escalation's easy. There's kind of the dynamic. If everybody's starts to get used to sniping at each other, then that's going to show up in control issues. Um, Not enough money is a big thing that will escalate things. If you're worried about keeping the business alive, then that focuses the mind. There's that old expression: "A rising tide lifts all boats." Well, the opposite is true. An ebbing tide reveals a lot of shipwrecks. Ego, plays a role. It just does. Perceptions of relative contributions of partners. If you think you're working hard and the other people aren't,
Hmm.
that can be an issue. That's actually something that we see as coming out pretty often, whether it's true or not. So I'm not sure why that is, but everybody always thinks they're working harder than everybody else.
Yeah.
Some people think they're just entitled to more deference just because of their title, age, experience, investment, whatever it may be.
So Jeff, you kind of just touched on it. You said you mentioned like in age experience, things like that. Do you feel a person is entitled to feel that way in a business if they do have that kind of seniority and that experience?
Well, people feel that way whether they should or not. So it's just something you have to deal with one way or another. But there are plenty of, in the tech industry, we see it a lot where if you're over 40 and you haven't made your payout, then you're kind of washed up. If you have made your payout and this is your third company, people respect that. But in my own industry, in law firms, the senior partners often want respect just because of their gray beard. And my beard's turning gray now. I don't think that means that I deserve anything in particular. I want to earn that.
Mm.
But it's how people feel. You just have to deal with it. Um, the other thing that escalates things is bad documents. If they're written poorly or in ways that channel people down pathways that will encourage conflict. Again, a little bit of conflict is good. Toxic conflict that escalates is not so good. That's escalation. For calming things down, it's when there's more money that's there. On the other hand, if there's too much money that's there, people fight over that. I remember one issue where there was there were extra tens of millions of dollars floating around, and they started fighting over who would get it, where they never would have fought, if it was $50,000. So it's a good problem to have, but sometimes it's too much of a good thing. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of focusing on the fundamentals, focusing on what's actually important to the partners, the ability to have communication between them. Uh, some of it is the things that'll calm down just any interpersonal fights. Some of it is can also be bringing in professionals to help fix the documentation, to help people communicate better. I've worked a lot with boards of directors that need where they're kind of squabbling with each other, and they need a facilitator to come in and help guide the discussion, particularly around strategic planning. So third parties can help if you use them right.
So Jeff, for business owners who want to avoid, control disputes down the road, what should they be thinking about before those problems surface, especially everything that you talked about today?
Sure. Well, first, the big question, and I sound like I'm on repeat, but what's your business? What does it need? And how do you do it? And, overlaid with that is, what do you need personally? I mean, is it, you're working for the dollar, but are you also working for ego? Are you working for the fact that you get to be in a physical space with other people? Are you working for, who knows what motivates people? You're working for a cause. So you overlay that with the business needs and start to think about it up front. Work out the basic structure of money. Kind of three different contexts. One is what happens when the business is sold. That's if it's a business. If it's a not-for-profit that you're working with, or some other kind of organization, that's not going to matter, obviously. What about money on an ongoing basis? Who controls the money? Who sees what happens on a day-to-day basis? Who gets the money? How are people paid? Who gets to say who's not paid? If you're deciding on employee bonuses, who's in that pool that makes the decision? And the other really big thing that we haven't touched on is what kinds of ongoing contributions might be needed in terms of money, because people do fight over that. A lot of LLCs will have or partnerships will have a capital contribution requirement. Corporations tend not to. Just because of the structure, people don't think about that. But if you're going to need more money as time goes on, and you want your investors or the people who are in the business to commit to putting in a certain amount, say that up front, or else somebody is not going to put the money in, and then you're going to be in an argument.
Awesome.
And the last thing is veto power. Think about who can say no. At least over major decisions and spending. Think about who's the public face of the business, because sometimes businesses need that. And at the end of the day, you have to ask the question, how much of this is really worth addressing up front? I would say, from my perspective, it's usually worth it. And it's probably worth talking to a lawyer or advisor about, because otherwise down the road, it may get a lot more expensive.
Amazing. Jeff, appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.
That's it for today's episode of Partnered Up, Business Law, Deals, and Dynamics. To learn more about Jeff Fink and his work with business owners and partners at Coren Lichtenstein LLP, visit cl-lawgroup.com. Thanks for listening. And if you found this episode helpful, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could use it as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.